So allow me to introduce our three panelists. In the center, we have Professor Wendy Matsumura, who is Assistant Professor of Japanese History. Her research focuses on the intersection of gender, class, and race in the constitution of the pre-war Japanese Empire, with an emphasis on post-annexation Okinawa. Her first book, The Limits of Okinawa, published by Duke University Press in 2015, is out, and you can buy it, and you should, if I may say so. And she's working on another book, which will be called The Shifting Frontiers of Empire, The Politics of the Household and Global Okinawan Struggle. Today, she will share some of her family's experiences with internment during World War II. And Simeon Man, who will be our first speaker, is Assistant Professor of Modern U.S. and Asian American History. His research examines the politics of race and war in American culture, and his essays have appeared in the American Quarterly and other edited anthologies. He's currently working on his book, Soldiering Through Empire, Race and the Making of the Decolonizing Pacific, which will be published from the University of California Press. And he will speak this evening about the impact of Executive Order 9066 on Japanese Americans during World War II. And finally, Wael al-Delaimy, Professor Wael al-Delaimy is Professor of Epidemiology and Global Health in the Medical School and Division Chief of Global Health. He's the author or co-author of nearly 100 scholarly articles and studies. Dr. al-Delaimy was born and educated in Iraq, partly at Mustansariya University, which I would point out. Does anybody know how long UCSD has been here? When was UCSD founded? 56 years. Wael's university was founded in 1233 in Baghdad. It's 800 years old. No, you're not that old. He wasn't, we can't call him one of the founders. He has been working in Jordan and has scientific collaborators all over the Arab world. He is the president of the Society for Advancement of Science and Technology in the Arab world. And every summer he leads groups of UC students to study abroad trips to work among Palestinian, Iraqi, and Syrian refugees in Jordan. He will speak tonight about his work and experiences among Middle Eastern refugees and people who stand to be excluded in today's executive order. Now, allow me to introduce the discussion generally. We began a couple of months ago by talking about an event such as this, when then candidate Donald Trump gave a speech promising what he called a total shutdown of Muslims entering the U.S. And I noticed from reading the newspaper and from talking with my colleagues that it was immediately obvious to Japanese American communities in the United States, and particularly in California, that these communities were more sharply attuned to this political language than other members of the public. And elderly Japanese Americans had heard these kinds of calls before, experienced the consequences, and immediately recognized the echoes. And we thought their experiences and the parallels with today were worthy of discussion. And then when the ban was announced a couple of weeks ago, many on this campus realized immediately that the effects would be profound and that they would affect working colleagues at universities around the country, international scholarly and scientific collaboration, graduate and undergraduate students in the UCs, in all of the UCs, and study abroad programs that are part of the core mission of the University of California and undergraduate education. We also realized and knew that hospitals and medical education programs around the country draw on physicians and residents from the 7 countries. And companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere recruit engineers and scientists from the 7 countries. It was also clear that the people who wrote the ban knew none of these things, had thought of none of these things. And as we began to discuss and plan the forum, we addressed our discussion and we discussed it as the Muslim ban, not the travel ban. And there was some well-meaning, a good suggestion to change the name of the panel. And directors Luis Alvarez and Mark Hanna said, no, we'll call it the Muslim ban. And we all felt that the original title was important. The president had called it a Muslim ban, and he and his advisors had changed the wording for legal and political purposes after that original discussion last year. But it is and is intended to be a ban on Muslims because they're Muslims in the United States. So willfully deceptive euphemism in political discourse are guaranteed to degrade democratic speech and engagement. Some people would call it a travel ban, a pause, things like this. But one of our goals for tonight was to move the discussion from the realm of bloodless abstraction about enforcement, national security, or protection of borders to concrete solidity of individual lives affected by these executive orders in 1942 and today. Now, 70-odd years ago, George Orwell argued that plain speaking and direct language is the antidote to authoritarianism. Now, some may have noticed, and it can't be an accident, that 1984 is back in the bestseller list. And, you know, for historians, a newly rediscovered classic gladdens our hearts. Not only that, but we also like to support the publishing business. So if you buy books, it's a good thing. We really think it's a good thing for you to buy books. But I would point out that Orwell has been dead for a long time, and he doesn't need the royalties. And if you want to read Orwell, you should read Orwell, but you can also read The Politics of the English Language, which you can get for free anytime. Next time you hear someone mention the temporary travel ban, remember the words from Orwell's essay, where he said, "In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible." So, The Politics of the English Language, 1946. It's a fast, wonderful read. Those of us making the comparison between 1942 and 2017 have been criticized for comparing two dissimilar executive actions. But, and people have argued and have said repeatedly that banning people from entry to the United States is not the same as imprisoning people who are already here, as in 1942. But the important point is that both actions relied on the idea of punishing people for what, not for what they had done, but for who they were, because they'd done nothing, any of them. Japanese or Japanese Americans in the first instance, and Muslim Arabs or Iranians in the second. And so this is why the comparison makes sense, because they didn't do anything. Both executive orders claimed vague national security imperatives, and both were vague and completely ineffective at achieving their stated purposes. Ineffective. And both executive orders appeared to be illegal under the U.S. Constitution and the prohibition against discrimination. They were illegal. And both executive orders were immoral and gratuitously cruel towards law-abiding innocent people who did nothing wrong, and in the case of today and in 1942, may be in dire need of help to save their very lives, in fact. So they are both ineffective, and they are both illegal, and they are both immoral. And that draws them together as well. Now, plenty of defenders of the Muslim ban have fallen back on euphemism and minimalism and said it's only a temporary pause for 90 days. But there are problems with this. The first is intent. It's abundantly clear that it was intended and designed as a ban on Muslims. Not all Muslims, perhaps, but many. And the second is that it's not temporary for the people who need the help the most. That is, Syrian refugees. Because for them, 90 days could well be the difference between life and death. That's the first problem. And secondly, the ban explicitly says that Syrian refugees, must be banned indefinitely from entry into the United States, not 90 days. In 1942, American citizens, especially Californians, consented mostly by their silence for the exclusion and disappearance of neighbors, friends, co-workers, students, and teachers. We don't know how many people opposed the disappearances, the internment in 1942, but by all accounts, it wasn't very many. Very few Californians stood up to protest the injustice meted out to their innocent Japanese American neighbors but we all live with the shame of those events and those decisions today. So history is merciless in its judgments, but memory is selective. We will be better people and a better society if we think ahead in the future and not think so much about the things that we do today and tomorrow, but how we will feel about the things we do or the things we do not do in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. How will we look back on today? That's my question for us. And so now, without further ado, please let's hear from Simeon. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing? So, thank you, Michael, for the introductions, and also thank you to everyone for being here. I know it's week 7, it's late in the evening, so really appreciate you joining us for this conversation tonight. This past Sunday marked the Day of Remembrance, marking the 75th anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066, which was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt. The executive order provided the basis for the mass removal and incarceration of close to 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens. The first Day of Remembrance actually began in 1978, and at the time it was conceived as part of the growing grassroots movement for redress, led by Japanese Americans, many of them 3rd generation, who were too young at the time or who were born after the camps. The movement for redress would go on for a decade, and it would officially come to an end in 1988 with the signing into law of the Civil Liberties Act by President Ronald Reagan. The Civil Liberties Act provided each surviving former internee with $20,000 in compensation for their financial loss and hardships as a result of their wartime incarceration. And additionally, the Civil Liberties Act also marked an official apology on the part of the US government, an acknowledgement of the, quote, fundamental injustice of internment. So what was this fundamental injustice? Right? That is the question that I want to pose and to talk through in the time that I have. What were the experiences like for those who were impacted by Executive Order 9066? So I'm going to talk a little bit about just the events leading up to Executive Order 9066 and the repercussions for it. But I also want to come back at the very end and talk about the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and to reflect a little bit about the legacies of Japanese American internment and what the Civil Liberties Act and official redress actually accomplished. So with that, I'm going to start with this image, okay, by our beloved Dr. Seuss. Everyone at UCSD loves Dr. Seuss, right? So just to give you a sense of kind of the pervasive discourse that we see during this time, during World War II, of Japanese Americans being treacherous, right, being a potential fifth column. All along the West Coast, you can't really differentiate anybody, right? Even if you're an American citizen, no one can be trusted. Right? I'm just going to leave that up there for a minute. Okay, so Executive Order 9066, what was it? So it was signed by the president 2.5 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The executive order authorized the Secretary of War to designate certain military areas from which, quote, any and all persons can be excluded, right? So it's important to realize that the executive order didn't actually specify people of Japanese ancestry, right? That language was not in the executive order itself, but nonetheless, it became very clear and very quickly that the executive order was meant at one particular group, right? Japanese, people of Japanese descent, including Japanese Americans. So within 2 weeks, the first public proclamation officially notified that all persons of Japanese ancestry, that they were going to be removed and excluded from the western parts of Washington State, Oregon, parts of California, and parts of Arizona. So these signs started appearing everywhere along the West Coast, on telephone poles. During the same time, a curfew was also put into place, mandating that all persons of Japanese ancestry, they remain in their homes between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m., right? They were not allowed to be in the streets. Anyone who were found in the streets would be arrested, right? So between March and April of 1942, 108 exclusion orders with the exact same instructions were issued. And each of these orders gave roughly 1 week for residents to collect their things and to prepare themselves for removal. So they were instructed explicitly to pack only what you can bring with you, right? So people, obviously, they didn't know for how long they would be gone for. Only packing what they could carry. Many residents were forced to sell their homes, right, to sell their businesses. They had no idea when they were going to come back, so many of them who could not, for example, trust their neighbors or trust their families or their friends to watch over their properties, they were forced to basically sell their properties at a significant loss, right? So here are just a couple of images, some closing sales that were happening, right, in the wake of the executive order and the orders for removal. And I think it's very striking, right, this kind of proclamation that I am an American. And in the image here, you can see a flag that has clearly recently been like unfolded, right, as a brand new flag, just as a way in which they could demonstrate that they were loyal, right? So this was kind of the predicament that Japanese Americans were facing during this time. So here's just another image of people getting ready to board a bus in San Francisco following the evacuation orders. And here you can see friends and families kind of saying their goodbyes, right? But it's only going to be about 3 days after this event happened that they would also be removed. So where were they evacuated to, right? So they were first moved to temporary assembly centers before they were taken to the more permanent camps, which were called relocation centers. These assembly centers were places like the Santa Anita racetracks, the Puyallup Fairgrounds up in Washington, and their living quarters were these animal stalls and barracks, right? So the conditions were deeply unsanitary, they were tiny, people were forced to sleep on makeshift cots made of straw. What I want to do right now is just to, instead of me describing what the experience was like, just to show you a very quick clip from a former internee describing her experience, okay, living in these assembly centers. All right, so for those of you who aren't familiar with Densho, so Densho Oral History Project is based out of Seattle, Washington, and it's actually, they're dedicated to kind of collecting oral history interviews of people, former internees. I think there are upwards of several hundred interviews documented, and it's a great teaching resource if you're interested in sharing some oral histories with your class. So I'm just going to show about
So you
2
arrived
minutes
at
of this.
Puyallup, and when you entered, do you recall any of the way
Well,
it looked, or?
you know, it was a former fairgrounds, which I had never been there before, so I didn't know. But the one thing I remembered was animal smells. You know, that's how fairs are. You have your animal smells. I remember that. That was very, very different for me. And then the living quarters, of course, were some of the stalls and some of the buildings. But we had one of the you know, the row of stalls, and so therefore the smells were greater there.
Mhm.
And I remember that there were cots and, for some reason, some kind of mattress. It wasn't the kind of mattress I was used to, but, and then army blankets. And then we had the bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. And each stall is yay big, and there were ceilings that they did not come to the top. So the walls, excuse me, didn't come to the ceiling. So you could see all the way across. If you climbed up on something high, you could see all the way to the other end, and voice traveled all the way through.
So you're all there together with your mother, your father, your two brothers, and yourself, in a barracks?
Yes, we had one. It wasn't even a barrack, it was a stall.
A stall.
It literally was a stall. And they told us it was temporary. So, you know, they just had to get us all assembled there so that they'll know which camps we're going to. So we had an idea that this was temporary, and that's where we're supposed to get ready for this. So part of that was inoculations. We all had to have a series of shots.
Now, what was that to prevent?
Diphtheria and smallpox and you name it. But I remember having at least 3 or 4 because my arms were just sore, and then there were scabs, you know, these black scabs that came out. And I remember feeling like that must be like how cows and animals, you know, feel like, all because we were all lined up. And we had to have a couple shots at a time, you know, because we couldn't keep coming back. So I remember having 2 shots, and then being very ill, or at least, you know, I felt ill about it, and a sore arm.
I can imagine. That's a pretty vivid memory for a 6-year-old.
Yeah, I remember those things that were kind of painful, and that definitely was a painful
Do you
time.
recall?
All right. So I also want to call attention to the ways in which the U.S. government, like what terms they use to describe these camps, right? So these were temporary assembly centers that they were removed to while the more permanent camps were built, right? The relocation centers. And I think the language itself is also a way in which the government was able to tone down the severity of the situation in which these people were confined in. So they were in these centers for 3 to 6 months, right? In these stalls, in these racetracks, for anywhere from a period from 3 to 6 months, while the 10 camps were being built. And the 10 camps were ultimately built in these very remote, barren desert locations in the interior of the United States. And something worth mentioning is that some of these places, including Poston, Arizona, was a Native American reservation, right? So, in fact, a lot of Asian American civil rights activists in the 1960s started to make these connections between Japanese American internments and this longer history of Native American removal that scholars have also started to explore as well. So there's a very interesting parallel history that's worth thinking about. So many of these camps were in the middle of the desert, right? They may not have been animal stalls, but one can hardly describe them as better living conditions, right? So the walls were made of tar paper, which offered very little protections from the natural elements, either in the winter or in the summer. So here's an image of the interior, of what the interior looked like, right? Just to give you a sense of both the lack of privacy, right? So these barracks were divided by like cloth, right? So offered very little privacy. And this picture also gives a sense of the ways in which the internees themselves sought to kind of recreate family life, right? To kind of remain resilient in the face of an impossible situation. Right? So trying to maintain a semblance of family life actually became quite a struggle. And we could see this in the ways that people talked about what eating at the mess halls was like, right? So eating, trying to keep the family together as a family unit, trying to keep the kids from running around, actually became something of a struggle. And in my class, that when I teach about Japanese American internment, something that I emphasize for my students is that we actually need to think about the ways in which everyday people responded to internments and resisted against their confinement, right? Oftentimes we think about the heroes, right? The people who took their cases to court, like Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, but how else might we think about resistance in the camps, right? And acts of agency. So I think things like trying to keep the family together, trying to like create a sense of normality, right, is something that we can think about. So some images of kids playing, right? So kids, if you listen to some of the oral history interviews, people who grew up in the camps had a completely different experience than their parents, right? For very obvious reasons, loosened from the confines of parents' restrictions, right? They can play, they can interact with their friends. And one way to think about internment also, and also to draw this, to go back to this connection between internments and Native American removal, is the way that internment actually represented, I think, a kind of compulsory assimilation, right? So second generation Japanese Americans were kind of given more of a more prominent role in kind of family affairs and also running the camps themselves, right? So kids were going to school, getting civics lessons. So a lot of historians and scholars have actually talked about internment as a kind of benevolent assimilation, right? A project of assimilation that was teaching them how to become proper American citizens before they were sent back out, right? So part of this compulsory assimilation was that the internees would actually continually be tested for their loyalty while they were in camps, right? I mean, literally, they were given things like the loyalty questionnaire, in which internees would be asked a series of questions, right? Questions like, what is your religion? How well do you speak Japanese, right? All of these things would be given points, right? If you're a Buddhist, you would get -1 or 2 points, right? So all to try to figure out to what extent are you a loyal citizen of the United States, right? So, all right, I think I'm running out of time, right? So I'm gonna rush through the remaining bits. Okay, so the camps, so through the loyalty questionnaire, internees were released, right? Beginning in 1943, there was a problem of the United States trying to justify its war against Nazi Germany, against Imperial Japan, and Imperial Japan basically calling out the US government for, like, this is what they're doing to their citizens, right? So the US government began a process of releasing internees beginning in 1943. Majority of them would actually remain in the camps through the duration of the war. The last camp closed in March 1946. And at the time that they closed, the US government would basically give internees a train ticket, $25, and they would be basically expected to go back to their homes and to rebuild their lives from scratch, right? So kind of the legacies of Japanese American internment, I think it's important to note that most people did not talk about their camp experiences for the longest time, right? It was simply too painful to talk about, right? And it wasn't until the 1960s, as I mentioned earlier, when Asian American activists started to, once again, politicize around the issue of Japanese American redress and demanding that the US government offer just compensation for the suffering incurred by the internees. So Japanese American redress, the movement kind of began in the 1970s, and it ended officially in 1988, as I mentioned earlier. The Civil Liberties Act was the official moments of recognition, of reckoning, right? So its signing into law appeared to finally close the books on this ugly chapter of American history, right? While it was deeply significant in that it provided some compensation and an official recognition of the fundamental injustice of internment, I also want to suggest that it had some quite severe limitations, right? Materially speaking, $20,000 was simply not enough, right? Considering the financial losses incurred by internees. But symbolically, I think there was also something quite dangerous in the ways that it portrayed internment as an aberrant moment in American history, right? As a moral failure on the part of the government, as something that was never allowed to happen again, right? This is something that happened in the past. We have offered our formal apology, right? The reckoning is over, right? Of course, as we know, redress did not end the practice of racist mass incarceration, right? At the same time that the act was passed, our country was witnessing a rapid expansion of the US prison regime, the criminalization of black and brown folks, and as we know, the war on terror would lead to yet another episode of mass incarceration without due process in places like Guantanamo, right? So I just want to end by calling attention to these other episodes, right, that have often been disconnected in our public discourse about the legacies of internment and also the contemporary Muslim ban, right? I think that it's important for us to think about these connections and also to kind of heed the kind of the message and also the people who are actually on the ground actively mobilizing, right? So they're people who were actively involved in the redress movements in the 1980s have been quite vocal in speaking up in the wake of the war on terror and also in their contemporary moments in trying to build alliances between Japanese internees and Muslim Americans. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have Professor Wendy Matsumura.
Hello. Can you see me? Is this all right? Okay. I also wanted to echo Simeon and Michael's thanks to the Institute of Arts and Humanities at UCSD for bringing the four of us, as well as all of you, together for what I hope will be an enriching conversation. And I especially wanted to, can you hear me? Okay. To thank Michael Provence for inviting me to participate. I don't have any slides, if that's the, yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm such a delinquent presenter. I have nothing to offer here. But I wanted to especially thank Michael because you know, his invitation actually forced me to think seriously about my own family's experiences with internment for the first time. And this has led me to request FBI files and immigration files and Office of Redress file, all these things that I'd sort of not dealt with for a good part of the last 3 weeks. So I've been kind of obsessed with figuring out what exactly happens with my family. And despite being a historian myself, family histories, I think, are often the most difficult to access and to interrogate. And so I've gained a lot just in the process of preparing for this event. So initially, Michael invited me to talk about Japanese internment within the context of my own work, which focuses on the formation of the Japanese Empire. But I kind of knew that this would be a challenge since Japanese internment is seen as part of the Japanese American rather than the Japanese experience, and it's thus not often dealt with in a great deal of historiography that I'm most familiar with, which is the historiography of modern Japan. And indeed, when I looked up research articles produced in the Japanese Academy on this topic, I could only find several, and most of them focused on the photographs that Ansel Adams took of life at Manzanar. And so I hope you'll forgive me here for not sort of taking that original task seriously here and leave that sort of issue of placing Japanese internment within the Japanese historiography for future work that maybe the whole field has to consider, and turn instead to a history that I'm also just beginning to know, which is my own family's experience with internment. And I want to share this with all of you, not in order to provide some kind of privileged account from somebody directly affected, but because learning about this has made me think more deeply about the unquantifiable and enduring intergenerational consequences of these state-perpetrated violences that can go unattended when we think of internment as a singular event that ended with the conclusion of World War II, or, you know, even as Simeon said, with redress. And so this is why I appreciate having conversations with experts here on this panel who are exploring these continuities and or parallels in great detail. So I just want to talk a little bit about my family. So my family is from Hawaii. And long before Pearl Harbor, my grandfather had already been the target of quite a bit of FBI scrutiny, as were many first-generation Japanese in Hawaii who'd maintained close ties to Japan. A report dated March 13th, 1940 states, quote, "The subject," it's my grandfather, "is considered pro-Japanese. Subject made trip to Japan and China front during 1939, and since his return to Honolulu has been lecturing on his experiences to the more ignorant Japanese. Subject alleged to have recently lost home and suffered financial reverses due to his shady practices," end quote. Among the practices that placed him under suspicion for espionage by the FBI included, for example, being a sponsor of the International Sumo Association, the fact that his eldest son, or my uncle, who'd graduated from the University of Hawaii, responded in the following way when he asked, "Is your United States citizenship today simply a matter of convenience?" He replied, "It appears to be that way," expressing that U.S. citizenship was the most pragmatic way that he could think of to go to law school where he wanted to go, which was the University of Michigan. It was reported also that my grandfather had been trying to convince local Japanese to move from Hawaii to Manchukuo, which was a recent Japanese colonial acquisition, in order to take up homesteads there. Finally, he was accused of being connected to efforts to aid the entrance of Japanese fishermen to Hawaii illegally. So he was a man of many interests, and all of these activities, as well as his very kind of visible position within the Japanese or Japanese American communities in Hawaii, as a publisher, as a Japanese language teacher, and as a one-time assistant to a major Buddhist temple, as well as his self-published works that revealed a strong support for Japanese expansionism in East Asia, made him the object of much suspicion when the Imperial Japanese Navy bombed Pearl Harbor. FBI records dated July 25th, 1942, indicate that my grandfather was taken into custody the day after Pearl Harbor based on a warrant that was authorized by the Secretary of War. So it sort of gets out of the executive order sort of narrative, but it sort of is reintegrated into that later. So a hearing board recommended internment for the following reasons. First, he was born in Japan, hence he is an enemy alien. Second, he admits his complete loyalty to Japan. Third, he made a statement at length which seems to indicate knowledge of the whereabouts of Japanese military forces. So based on these reasons, the military government of Honolulu ordered his internment on February 17th of 1942. It's a little complicated, right? I mean, and as a historian, I'm always sort of telling my students to be very sort of suspicious of official records, of official files, especially as they're written within a context that is already quite racialized. But sort of makes me a little bit uncomfortable about his, professed sort of support for expansionism as a critic of the Japanese Empire. Anyway, so my father, right, was at the time that my grandfather was taken, was seven years old. And so how does he fit into all of this? So he states in his testimony that he wrote to the Office of Regis Administration that he doesn't remember much. And he relies on his two older sisters' testimonies to claim compensation from the ORA. And according to a testimony that was given by my aunt, who is his older sister, after their father was taken into custody, their mother, as well as the 5 minor children, had no idea where he'd been taken to or when they could be reunited. Their older brother, the one that had failed the pre-war loyalty questioning, but who had just passed the bar, found work as a construction worker in order to support the family. Finally, in the summer of 1942, the Justice Department notified my grandmother that she and her 5 young children were to join their father in an internment camp on the mainland. And they were relocated along with 30 to 40 other families. So upon receiving this notice, they departed Honolulu on a military transport to San Francisco. They took a ferry to Oakland and then boarded the train for Asheville, North Carolina. Perhaps due to my grandfather's espionage charges, they were taken to 2 detention areas that were reserved for diplomats of the Axis powers. They arrived in Asheville, North Carolina at the Grove Park Inn, which is a restricted area, on August 20th, 1942, and then were transferred to a similar facility in Montreat, I don't know how to say this, North Carolina on October 29th, 1942. So they're moving a lot. I mean, is basically what I want to say. Finally, on March 5th of 1943, they arrived at Crystal City Family Internment Camp in Texas and were reunited with their father for the first time in a year and a half. And soon thereafter, they were taken to Jersey City, where the SS Grips home transported them along with 1,500 other passengers who were scheduled to be repatriated as part of an exchange negotiated between the Japanese Foreign Ministry and the U.S. Department of State. And my father and my aunts and uncles were part of the 100 or so Japanese American children who also made this journey. So they departed on September 1st, 1943, traveled throughout South America, the Cape of Good Hope, to Goa, which was the site of the repatriation, and there was a kind of a prisoner or citizen exchange that took place. From there, the passengers, including my family, changed ships and traveled to Manila, Singapore, and then they finally arrived in Yokohama, Japan on November 14th, 1943. They immediately moved to Kumamoto, Japan, which is where my grandfather was originally from. And in December of that year, 1943, my father enrolled as a first grade student at a local elementary school. And my Aunt Rose testifies that things were difficult in Japan because their loyalty was questioned there as well. So she writes, upon arriving in Japan, father, who was my grandfather, was plagued with rumors that he was an American spy. So the Japanese military police began to look into him. And she continues, students would ask if our father was still at home, meaning, was he taken away? Had he been taken away by the Japanese military police yet? So save these suspicions, my father and the rest of the family escaped relatively unscathed from the war in Japan and remained there until after surrender. My father actually graduated from high school and college in Japan and finally returned to Hawaii in 1961. All of my aunts and uncles also eventually returned to Hawaii and resided there until their deaths. And this is where the story should end if we are invested in putting forth a narrative about some kind of long-awaited and successful return, right, to their homeland of Honolulu, Hawaii. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of gaps to be filled in here. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to ask my own father or my aunts and uncles about their experiences during the war, and they never offered any of this up. There was a silence in my family that I never really knew was present, though looking back, there were definitely glimpses from time to time. For example, once or twice during my childhood, my father would kind of brought home books about Manzanar or about Asian American history. I think he brought home like Ron Takaki's book without any commentary. He just kind of put it on the table. I found out after my father's death that his mysterious distaste for even the sight of chicken stemmed from the fact that the clearest reminder for him as a 7-year-old of his time in the internment camp in Crystal City was chickens. I mean, similar to the smell, that sort of lingers in the testimony that we heard during Simeon's presentation. And there are probably other hints and other slight openings for conversation that neither of us took, right, that I will come to recognize as such later, as I learn more and more about his experience and as I learn more about this broader history. Honestly, though, even if he and his brothers and sisters were still alive and willing to share, I'm not even sure what I would ask, right? These silences, which were left uninterrogated, are scars that all families with traumatic pasts carry with them, and they leave their marks in ways that are difficult, extremely difficult to calculate. One thing that I do know is that over 50 years after the fact, and a few years before his death, my father was still trying to work through this time in his life. So he, with the help of his older siblings, began the process of filing for a redress under some kind of special exemption with the Department of Justice's Office of Redress Administration in 1995, so well after this whole thing was supposed to have come to an end. To my great surprise, he began these proceedings on July 14th, 1995, which is my birthday, and the year that I first left Honolulu to attend college in upstate New York. It's entirely possible that he decided to file because he desperately needed this $20,000 to pay for my college education. even though, of course, this money does not begin to compensate for all of the sort of, property and damages, and community that was lost on a massive scale as a result of internment and incarceration. Still, though, I'd like to take the fact that he filed on my 18th birthday as a message of some sort to me, which I've taken selfishly to mean that I should always be suspicious, not of those who are accused of being disloyal or traitors to the nation, but of those who hurl such accusations at others in order to advance a specific worldview or a normative definition of personhood as universal. So I share his, as well as my grandfather's story with you today as a reminder that while stories of exceptional figures whose lives or potentials were cut short are definitely important to tell and lament, right, and mourn, we should also be attentive to the experiences of those who are deemed unremarkable, unproductive, or even disloyal when thinking about the consequences of internment, incarceration, exclusion, and so forth. These are also lives worth fighting for, particularly because they challenge the normative conceptions of citizenhood and personhood that states put forth to legitimate inequality, discrimination, and exclusive conceptions of community. And so I look forward to talking and thinking with all of you tonight about how to strategize and how we can kind of work together from here and in our extended communities to fight the racist, the Islamophobic, the misogynist sentiments that the current round of executive orders authorizes and promotes, learning from the diversity of experiences of Japanese internment in order to prevent the immediate and enduring violences that these orders will surely perpetrate if we don't fight together. Thank you.
And now we have Professor Wael al-Delaimy.
It's loaded. Oh, it's not loaded. Okay. Oh. Okay, I don't know which changes.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the sobering history that really brings us to today, but also a reflection of how sad these stories are. And part of this presence and part of the reaction of what happened to the Muslim ban is completely different to my gratitude and my delight that no one is quiet about what could happen as a result of these. I don't have historical background. I consider myself an amateur historian, but whenever Michael asks me, I never say no, because I think if I hadn't gone into the medicine field, I would have probably been a historian. So I'm going to provide something a little bit different, and that is about the story of the Syrian crisis and the refugees. This is the area I work on, refugee health. And just give a glimpse, it's just 15 minutes, so I can't cover everything, but hopefully we'll cover more during the Q&A. So I want to go back, in short-term history of how the situation began in Syria, because that is the kind of the focus of all this Muslim ban and whatnot. So the Arab Spring started in around 2010, and with this logo that it's power by the people, to the people, for the people, against dictatorships for decades that have been ruled these areas. So there was a recipe of young educated generation, ambition to prosperity, no job or career potential, and living in this global village where they can see and hear and know what everyone else is doing outside their country. And then they managed to break down through the fear factor. And that is when this revolution, or the Arab Spring, became an inspiration for all. This is a map, and showing it started here in Tunisia. It's not very clear because of the lighting, but if somebody can lower it a little bit. So it started in Tunisia, then in Libya, and then in Egypt. They toppled all those dictators who have been ruling for many, many years. And then in Yemen, it started in Iraq, in Bahrain, and in Jordan, as well as in Morocco. But they were managed to be subdued. And Syria was left. And the regime there was very anxious and looking all these dictators around them being pushed aside. So they were ready and their finger on the trigger. And the fuse of that in 2011 in March was started by teenage children who simply out of their school went and put on the wall, "The people wants to topple the regime," just in line of this kind of Arab Spring that was going, in that spirit. What happened, they were teenagers, they were taken by the security forces, tortured, killed, and their bodies returned to their families. Of course, people were in that city of Daraa were outraged, and they went out in demonstration, simple, peaceful demonstration, but then they were killed and gunned down, and that started a revolution of hundreds of thousands all over the country, revolted against the regime that has been punished them for tens of years. So it started with children. And this is the most recent map of today's Syria and the different areas of influence. So the yellowish is the Kurdish, Syrian Kurdish movements or forces that are in control of the north. The darkish is the ISIS, and the green is the rebellions or the Free Syrian Army and other allied forces that started the revolution before all this happened. And then the red is the regime and their militia. So what started by just a peaceful revolution turned into armed conflict because of the crackdown of the regime. So there was the Syrian Free Army, and then this is not clear, unfortunately, but basically it started with the Syrian Free Army, and then that became, as the rebellion continued and the West was just watching and seeing how this is going on, that attracted the extremist ISIS, who came with an agenda to terrorize and take over even the opposition. They were fighting more the opposition than the regime to take over. And that in itself brought another group, which is probably the most terrible and destabilizing, which is the pro-Iranian militia and Hezbollah. Because they came with that religious agenda that this is, countering the ISIS, and what they did and the atrocities that have been done by them is as bad or even worse, but we don't hear a lot about it. I met somebody who was a refugee, a Syrian refugee here, and he was telling me, he said he knew I'm from Iraq, and he said, those Shia militia from Iraq were the worst. The regime might come, kill back and forth, but those guys, when they come, they just massacre people. And when we hear about them, we just go and run. And he said, in my village, they rounded 600 people and just executed them. So it's the fear factor. It's not about just winning the war. And that is when the situation became even more complicated. Russia came in, and now what has been happening. Why I'm giving this history? Because the people of Syria have no say of this. The refugees who are coming here and who else, they got caught in this crossfire of these different regional powers. And so here are the numbers. We have in Turkey, about 1.8 million Syrian refugee. In Iraq, about 250,000. In Jordan, about 600,000. In Lebanon, 1.1 million. Egypt, 132. And North Africa, 24,000. Those are all refugees who went from Syria and got accepted in these countries. And this is a picture here of the Zaatari refugee camp, which is now the third biggest city in Jordan. And you can see it's a tent city, and the situation when it rains is terrible. You just can't go there. And this is on the border with Syria. So those are the refugees who are waiting for, you know, being resettled in other countries. And there are three categories. There are the internally displaced who didn't leave Syria. They displaced from their homes to other place. This is a refugee. Or the transition, like those folks in Jordan and Turkey and others. Or the resettled who come here or Europe being resettled by UNHCR. This iconic picture won a prize because it shows the sea of people and the destruction in the background. This is a Yarmouk refugee camp. And those people are Palestinian refugees displaced from their homes in 1948 after the war with Israel. And they were never allowed to come back, so they were settled there as a camp. Now they have been displaced again during the Syrian conflict because look at the bombing and fighting, and they were, you know, the regime, the Syrian regime does this sanction and closing until people die from hunger and lack of medicine. So this is when there was some aid coming and people were going out to get food and aid. This is the story of refugees. They are, you know, in this case, twice displaced over a period of 60 years. And this iconic picture is of those people who were fleeing, and this child was drowned, and the sea kind of brought him to shore to Turkey. And this caught the imagination and attention of many, including Prime Minister of Germany, who as a result opened the door to refugees and in compassion of this very sad picture. The situation of these wars also have a direct effect, mental and physical. The physical is seen and may be treated, but the mental is much more grave, and this is an area that I've been working on. And I don't have time to go over that, but just to kind of show you some of the pictures, this is the kids who are fleeing through to Europe by foot and being you know, pushed back or harassed or detained, and you know, all the stories you've heard about. And also all of these in the name of nationalism in Hungary or in the Czech Republic or other places that they have prevented them. They were all going to Germany because, you know, they heard the Prime Minister there, the Chancellor Merkel say, you know, you are all welcome. So they wouldn't want to stay, but they were even prevented from going through. And the trauma is lasting. This is another child looking in despair, and you know, the eyes and the face tells a lot, 1,000 words. And this is a recent picture of Omran, who moved the US population because of the CNN anchor who was emotional. How many of you have seen this, just by show of hands? Yeah, about half of you. So this has kind of brought the Syria war to home here. This is just 2 months ago. And this kid, the thing that was striking about him, for those who didn't see him, he was pulled from the rebels. Russian planes bombed his home, and he was pulled and put in this ambulance. And a few seconds, he was just silent, doing nothing, not crying, and he was just wiping his hand, looking at the dirt on his hand, and then wiping it as if nothing has happened. And that was so striking. How could a kid, you know, just lose everything and not even cry? That is the psychological and mental damage that has affected millions of children. This is a first-hand account from one of my colleagues who is at a camp in Greece. She said a 9-year-old refugee asked if I can adopt her. And when I asked why, she mentioned that her father had passed away during the war and life has no meaning now, and that her family doesn't mean much. This is a 9-year-old kid wanting to abandon her family and seeking this doctor to adopt her. This situation there in Thessaloniki is the worst, because the refugees have paid all they can for smugglers to take them across the sea, Asian Sea, to Greece to go into Europe, but they have been since prevented. There's really no health care, and they are crowded in tents, waiting for any kind of way out. These are some of the routes that refugees have taken. So going through land or through sea, just to go and escape the war that they have been caught in. More than 250,000 civilians have been killed and 11 million displaced. And look at this map. This is all children, number of children who have been displaced in each country: 77,000, 291,000, 385,000 children in Lebanon, in Turkey, all this. So those refugees are mostly children as well as women. And this is the quote last year from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees: Syria is the biggest humanitarian and refugee crisis of our time. Yes, nothing has happened in recent history as has happened in the Syrian crisis. Here are some of the aspects that refugees suffer. They lose everything: poverty and food insecurity. There is no health care access whatsoever. Some face abduction and human trafficking, like the camp in Greece. I was told by my colleague there, saying, people are coming from outside the camp, it's not secure, they go and mingle with kids, give them drugs, and then, take them. So a lot of these things are happening. Hostile or unwelcoming host countries, especially in Europe, I have to say, all of these countries that I mentioned, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, have been so much generous in offering whatever they have as part of their obligation towards their brethren. Destruction of family and community, forced labor, mental and physical handicap. The important thing is that it's not their choice. It's not fun. It's not they want to enjoy a better life. They have no choice, and they have nowhere to go, and there's no hope of insight of this escalation of this war and conflict. So I'm going to give you a little bit refugee statistics for facts. And 65 million refugees worldwide, active refugees. This is a record. This is UNHCR data. 40 million displaced internally and 21 displaced externally. 12 million newly displaced only in 2015. This is a 2015 data, which is 34,000 per day. 34,000 refugees is displaced every day. And the two top countries that are taking refugees all over the world are Lebanon and Jordan. And they are two of the poorest countries, by the way. This is per capita, of course. 86% of refugees are hosted by the less developed countries. They're not the US, they're not the Western or the more developed countries. It's the poorer countries. And 51% are less than 18 years old. So in terms of the US and in terms of the Muslim ban and the pretext for this, for security, this is from the Cato Institute, just recently released. Terrorism acts in the US committed since 9/11 were of citizens, US citizens and legal residents. Syrian refugees accepted in the US have been 15,000 from all 4 million Syrian refugees. And since 2011, only 0.63% of all refugees admitted to the US were Syrians. 2 to 3 years of vetting by up to 15 US government agency with several interviews before anybody can even set foot here. And as I mentioned, the large majority are children. So not your typical terrorists or people who are going to pose a threat to this country. Other facts. Of the close to 900,000 refugees admitted from 2011, only 3 have been convicted of planning clumsy, unsuccessful terrorist attacks. And while in comparison, one in every American, one in every 22,000 American committed murder in 1 year. So the chance of being murdered by in a terrorist attack committed by a refugee is 1 in 3.64 billion. And this is the same source. So you are much more likely to be struck by lightning or, you know, attacked by a shark or whatever so these are the reactions. This is just 2 days ago from Chancellor Angela Merkel saying Europe must take more refugees and Islam isn't source of terror. And Justin Trudeau, this is him welcoming Syrian refugees in the airport and giving them gifts, and this is from his Twitter: to those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you, regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. Welcome to Canada. These are the ethical and moral leaders of today. And this is what the son of Donald Trump, our president, said, which represents really the view of the president, saying that if you had a ball of Skittles and I told you just 3 would kill you, would you take a handful? That's our Syrian refugee problem. The thing he missed, of course, you need a very, very big ball of Skittles with those 3 Skittles. It's just dehumanizing. It goes back to what we heard. It's dehumanize, and that's what the ISIS does. That's what the Shia pro-Iranian militia does when they kill and butcher children. And this, luckily, it's not butchering and killing, but it's still dehumanizing, and that makes it easy to accept. So I want to end with, given this about Islam, some of the historical fact from my humble amateur historian background about accepting or supporting people in need and refugees. In the Spanish Inquisition, when the minorities were persecuted, whether they're Jews, Muslims, or other Christian sects, the Ottoman Muslim Empire opened its door and accepted the Jews as well as the other minorities to live in their land and prosper. During the Nazi era, the French Jews were hid in mosques by Muslims, Muslim French. And then fleeing Tutsis in the Rwandan genocide were also protected by Muslims in these countries. Now, why is that? Because this is part of the teaching of Islam. Islam's first community were a group of refugees and those who gave them shelter. And giving asylum and protection to anyone seeking it is a religious requirement. It's not even a choice. And you can see why all these Muslim countries accepted refugees, whoever they are, and never turned them back. And of course, giving priority to the most vulnerable. And why is that? And this is a text from the holy book of the Quran, of the Muslims, and those who before them had settled in homeland and had accepted faith, they love those who immigrated to them and find no hesitation in their hearts in helping them. They give them priority over themselves, even if they themselves are needy. Whenever whoever is protected from his natural greed, it is they who are the successful. Thank you.
Members, and now invite your questions. Now that the lights are on, I can actually see you.
We have a microphone, so if you want to ask a question, can you please raise your hand and we'll hand it over.
If you raise your hand, the microphone will come to you, and everyone will be able to hear you. Gentleman in the back there.
Testing. It works. All right, I'm coming to you because I saw you first.
Hi there. So I'd like to ask a question. 84% of Republicans, according to a recent Pew Research poll, show that they still support Donald Trump. And we've discussed many narratives tonight. When sharing these narratives, what is the goal to have in mind if we want to reach these 84% of Republicans? Are we talking about inspiring empathy, shame, and connection to these past events? Or are we trying to do something else? And once we've decided how we're supposed to craft these narratives, how do you penetrate the Republican echo chamber? Right now, we're in kind of an echo chamber ourselves. So how do we go from here to their chamber? Thank you.
I can answer that because I'm neither a Republican or Democrat. I think, you know, in any kind of media, I lived under a dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. And today, unfortunately, there's a different dictatorship, a theological dictatorship, also in Iraq. And what I noticed is that in all cases, you know, it's the opposite what was in Saddam's time and now. People tune in and listen to what they want to listen. And I think it applies here as well. The media is a very, very powerful tool that all dictators know very well, and they try to control it, and they try to streamline it. And that is more or less what we should try and do, is to go beyond the usual stream of media. But I don't think shaming or blaming is a way, because I think everybody is good and everybody is really believing that they're doing the good thing. But the justification for it is flawed. And as with any nationalistic movement in history, they go for the fear factor. I was listening to a CNN interview with an older lady after the Muslim ban. I was just shaking my head. I mean, hearing what she's saying. She was saying, I thank President Trump for doing the ban. Now I feel safer going in the airplane. I feel safer walking in the streets. I feel, you know. So I'm thinking, wow, is it really that effective that people will immediately think it's safe because now the ban is immediately there? So there's a disconnect. And there is this, once you're isolated, then you can't break through out of that. So that's a long answer, but I don't think anybody has the right answer.
I would say personal touch. If people realize that the costs of policies and things that they support harm people who may be their acquaintances or people who they can know about or meet, I think that this is the possibility that people may change their views and see that there's a human cost to these policies, these abstractions, these kinds of abstract notions of protection from undifferentiated people who are not concrete people of direct experience. So I think direct experience is a discussion of direct experiences is the key to changing people's minds.
We have another question over here.
Hello. Regarding the Japanese internment, is there any evidence that President Roosevelt was actually trying to shield the Japanese Americans from violent backlash by other Americans? It's my understanding in Hawaii there was no internment of the Japanese, and of course we have a major military base there. I'd like your thoughts on that. Thank you.
There was no mass internment, mass incarceration of people in Hawaii. Mostly that was because Hawaii was quite dependent on Japanese immigrant workers to sustain the plantation system. So incarcerating majority of the plantation workforce would cripple the sugar plantation economy in Hawaii. The question about FDR, whether there was any evidence of him wanting to shield Japanese Americans from reprisals from other Americans, is not something that I'm very familiar with, not to my knowledge. Although I think certainly the language that the War Relocation Authority, which was in charge of running the show, the way that they justified it was that it was a benevolent gesture, right? It was all done in the name of protecting Japanese Americans. It was to kind of teach them how to assimilate into American culture, right? That we're providing all of these things for them in the camps. So there was a constant effort to downplay the severity of their incarceration and what their experiences were like.
We have another question. Oh, sorry.
Hello, first of all, I want to thank you all for being here and being on the panel. I'm a health sciences faculty here at UCSD, and I just want to make just a comment and also ask a question. I don't have my own personal experience, but I just want to talk a little about the human factor and about sort of the personal experience. So my father was in the internment camps when he was about 6 years old. And I guess he's an example of someone who didn't really adjust well to being in the camps. The first time I learned he was in it was when I was in 7th grade in U.S. history. And the teacher looked at me and said, "Oh, your dad must have been in the camps." And I was like, "What?" I had no idea. So part of the problem is a lot of the internees will not talk about it. It's too painful. And in terms of the question that gentleman had about protecting them, I mean, when the Japanese Americans were let out of the camps, they were subject to intense racism on the West Coast. They came back to California. So I'm not sure, my feeling from this, and my dad really won't talk about it, is that no, they were not placed in camps for protection, because from all accounts, the guns were always pointed inward and not outward. So that's an account that, that's classically talked about. So anyway, about that. I do feel, about the internment, I do feel very personal about it, because I think, unfortunately, it kind of sapped the soul out of Japanese American people. It's very difficult to be a sansei like my father was, third generation American Californian, born in the United States, only knowing English, and being told you're not American. And so he, you think, oh, I'm an American, I'm fine, and then you're put in camps and you realize you are not. And so I think that it's very important for all of us, and I'm even myself, I thought about this ever since I've heard about the reference to the executive order that put the Japanese Americans in camps, that we cannot let this happen to another group of people. We just can't. Because if America continues doing this, where they sap the soul out of groups of people, you're going to have a country of people who don't try, who don't care. And there's huge repercussions that just extend from generation to generation. So I'm ready to go strike, or whatever I need to do to make sure another group of people, Muslims, whoever, do not have to be subject to something like this. It's wrong on every level. And the question I want to ask is, if an order comes out that, oh, you have to register and say, you're a Muslim or whatever religion you are, that if you advise just not doing it. I mean, don't make it easy for them. Apparently the census that was done around World War II kind of helped people find the Japanese Americans. It made it a little bit easier to round them up from camps. So I just want to see what the panel thought about that.
I think that's one way to do it.
I think the wise thing to do is organize ourselves and prepare in ways that will help each other. Because I have to say, I'm talking on behalf of the San Diego Muslim community. It was just overwhelming. It was just amazing, the kind of support that came pouring. I just asked yesterday, we have a small, relatively small community, so we're not as organized as other communities that have been well established. We have one civil liberties organization called Council on American Islamic Relations, of a staff of 1.5. And I saw him, I said, his name is Hanif. I said, Hanif, how's it going? He said, I have 6,000 emails in my inbox. So the support has been overwhelming, but also there still is not a lot of organization on how can this be dealt with, because this is not ending, unfortunately. If you're following the news, we're expecting something next week or something like that to further do this executive order. So I think we need to think of ways that we can support each other, support Muslim or any other, Latino or any other community. This is history repeating itself. Luckily, this time we're prepared. And if it was, the African Americans initially, or the Jews, or the Italians, or the, Irish, or whoever, this time it begins with this. And I can tell you from my experience living in Iraq, is in any dictatorship, they start, test the water, and then if there's compliance, then goes to the next step, and then third step. So I think the reaction was just amazing, that even the administration and the people behind it are having second thoughts. So I think we need to just think of that way. And the students' bodies, by the way, are the most powerful dynamo for this. Dictators fear students the most. Not that we have a dictatorship, luckily, thus far, but I'm telling you, when we were in universities in Iraq, no three people could congregate together without being questioned by the security. So, just some background.
We have another question over here.
So the person who just spoke, okay, one of the reasons why I was really interested in actually participating in this panel, besides being asked by Michael, is because some of us faculty here have been trying to figure out ways that we can organize ourselves, that we can sort of connect with faculty across divisions, and also with other faculty members at the other institutions, including the community colleges, to figure out some sort of kind of much more kind of organized or coordinated response to all of these things that we know are sort of in the pipeline. And so for you or other people who are interested in sort of joining us, you can definitely email me. And we're also very interested in forging stronger connections with undergrad organizations as well. So, it's sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to come here, and why I'm so grateful for such a large turnout, is because we are, really interested in kind of forging or reforging those links here as well as in our broader communities.
We have a question over here.
Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. I just wanted to thank the panelists so much and the organizers for this. It's fantastic that you all are doing it, and I really learned a lot from the talk. I just want to kind of give a little bit of background before I go into my question. So I think the last question really helped me think through this a lot. My name is Sophia Arman. I'm an ethnic studies student here, graduate student. And I'm part of an organization that works with Middle Eastern and North African folks, both in diaspora and here. And one of the things that I think is important when we think about the Muslim ban is actually placing it in history, which I think was so wonderfully done in this panel, connecting it to how the US has consistently made kind of racial projects to create others in the US, right? And it doesn't matter actually how good folks are, or if they, assimilate well or whatever. And I think it's really important for folks to know that this program particularly has a predecessor in something called NSEERS, which I really encourage everybody to Google. NSEERS, NSEERS, was actually created in the Bush administration, also used in Obama's administration, which literally created a very similar list of countries and system, which really was expanded now under Trump. So I guess my question is really about this. When I was part of a group of folks who were literally doing translations at the airport the second that the executive order went down, and one of the things that was very apparent was the ways that actually people were collapsing really important differences of communities, and the ways that we weren't actually centering the folks themselves who were being impacted the most. So for an example of this is the way that white supremacy works in the US is that it basically means Muslim equals Middle Eastern equals Arab, and we are taught that, and so we also build our allyship around that. So I guess the question that I have for you all is, is how can we build and maybe even look to moments, for example, with the executive order of Japanese internment, how can we build resistances that are cross-coalitional, but that also center the voices of those most impacted? Because when we actually look at how this executive order went down and how it will be going down again, we see it's a lot more messy and in that way even more violent because it's based on creating racism, not just about religious discrimination, but that Islamophobia is a racialized process, right? So in other words, you can't register for the Muslim registry, right? Because that's not how it's been going down. So how can we create resistances that think about racism?
Well, I guess the ban is based on geography. People who wrote the ban have a loose apprehension of geography and a loose understanding of the national, linguistic, religious, cultural differences in people in the Middle East. So specificity is always the specificity in precise facts, I think, is always the antidote to misinformation and ignorance in a broad sense. So I think, does that begin to answer your question? I mean, the Syrians, for example, I wanted to say something about this. Syria, which is the principal target of the ban, I would say, and the people who are banned from entry into the country as refugees in perpetuity, despite the claims of the temporary ban, are the same people who sheltered, fed, clothed, and housed, I guess I said sheltered and housed, 2 or 3 million Iraqi refugees from the war in 2003. So that's a pretty important, without any assistance or help from the United States. So the detritus, the destruction, the suffering of that war was born in a very direct way, not only by Iraqis, of course, but also by the people of the surrounding countries who fed them when they became refugees from their country after we destroyed it. So this is not a trivial matter or a matter, but it's a point that requires factual knowledge and some historical memory. And so I think that those are the things that people need to understand and to realize. And that's what I also, when I pointed out that the deep immorality of these kinds of things ignore this recent history in which the United States is deeply implicated on every level as the principal force of destruction, actually, in the Middle East. And I say that advisedly, the principal force of destruction in the Middle East. So the consequences of these humanitarian disasters come right back home. They originate here. And this is this sort of thing that citizens of this republic, I think, should know.
We have another question over here.
Hi. Hello. Hi. I'm an undergrad student at UCSC. I am personally interested in immigrant rights and refugee rights even before Trump was a candidate for presidency. And what I've noticed after his presidency and his executive order is the biggest two things I've noticed is how quick people are to base their decisions upon their candidates' words. And another thing I was really surprised was that there has been a big dispersion between people who are legal immigrants and illegal immigrants. And I personally do not believe that there's such thing as illegal immigrants and they should be sent back. So my question is, as an undergrad, young student who are in their early 20s, looking to grow into this modern world with all this racism and bad things going on, what can I do as a young person to start every day in my daily life to address these issues and just bring differences closer. And I don't know what I can do as a young person, you know, in my everyday life. Because for a lot of people, bad things happening to them every single day of their lives. And for me, I just get to go to school, I get to go home, I have my own car. So what can I do as a student, as a young person who has this prestige of, you know, living in San Diego, or to do, you know, good for people who actually need help?
The thing that I'll say is that you shouldn't feel that the burden is on you to reinvent the wheel, right? Or that you need to, like, this burden of trying to figure out what to do. Like, I think one easy thing, not easy, but one thing that you can consider doing is just to tap into things that are already happening, right? So organizations either on campus or off campus, like local San Diego community organizations, or you can even come and talk to Wendy or I or myself about how to get involved with just the work that some of the faculty and students are trying to do right here on campus. So I think that could be a good starting point, right? Just having conversations with people who are already doing the work so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself.
I would like to say that, you know, there are always good and bad things. I mean, looking at the same thing, the good thing here is that it is helping people like you and in your generation to think beyond what you just described. That there are things, you know, and people suffering and others that brought it home and to your attention. And the nice thing is you can do something about it because you have the freedom to do it. No one can prevent you to be active, you know, within the law and form organization, activism. You know, the social media made miles away so close by connecting. And so I agree with Simeon that, you know, you could, if you see a gap that nobody's filling, you can start that, and you feel proud about it. You're initiating it. But if others are doing it, join it. And there's much to do, believe me.
Hi. First off, thank you for doing this. I found these lectures very informative and enlightening. Lately, what I've been noticing is that there are a lot of conservatives and various Republicans who have been quick to shut down any similarities between the Japanese internment camps and the Muslim ban by pointing out that, well, one is a ban on people entering the United States, and another is simply imprisoning people already inside the United States. However, in a December 2015 interview with Newsweek magazine, Donald Trump was asked what he thought about the Japanese internment camps and if he would be open to the possibility of doing similar measures towards Muslim Americans. And instead of outright condemning the Japanese internment camps or saying that he would never do such a thing, he instead stated that he would be open to the possibility of enacting similar measures towards Muslim Americans. And the shocking reality is that Donald J. Trump is doing all the atrocious measures that he said he would during his campaign. My question to all of you here is that, do you think that it is likely that Donald J. Trump might enact similar measures towards Muslim Americans that he did towards Japanese Americans, like in regards to maybe internment camps towards Muslim Americans, and what are ways that can be done to combat stuff like this? For instance, his Muslim ban is already a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of religion, and the 14th Amendment, equal protection under due clause. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think Simeon probably knows this history a lot better than I do, but I think what brings all of us here, right, and sort of talk about it as sort of this land of whatever, right, democracy and equality and all these sorts of things, but the very fact of the matter is that our country was founded on all sorts of sort of similar sort of exclusions, racialization, genocide, all of these sort of acts that we have to kind of be aware of and connect. You know, that's sort of, I think, where I see my task as a historian, is to connect all of these things, because even if things, you know, there are specificities, these things are being sort of done to, and despite the fact that they're being targeted at different groups of people, that's the very way in which this works, right? Is you have sort of racialization, you have the creation of hierarchies of different groups of people being more sort of American than others. And I think where this goes, I mean, I think it depends on what we do and how we fight against it. So I don't know about, you know, I mean, I don't know about, I can't predict the future, but I think that fear is what brings all of us together.
Just very quick one thing. So in anything, when these things happen, there are always what's called the upstream predictors, or the area. You know, you set the scene first. You set the environment, and then you can do it. You can't just overnight decide, you know, we're going to just. So there are always steps, and the rhetoric has been going on for more than a year through the campaign. Muslims. So then a portion of this population bought into that. They now do fear that, you know, Muslims and Islams are going to do this, that, which is nonsense and non-factual. So the way to disrupt that is what has happened, is that the people who are realizing this come together and do something about it, because silence is the worst thing, because if the silence is there, it's going to be filled by even a small minority of the people who are pro or anti, and are going to fill that, and then that's it. So I hope that answers.
I said I was going to be the moderator, and I haven't done anything. So this gentleman here has been waiting a long time. Okay, this gentleman. Sorry. Maybe I'm not, maybe I don't have a useful role to play here, actually.
I guess I'll try to convert this into a question. I just have 50,000 comments. But I think that in response to, I think, the comment back with the student, and this is coming from, I'm a health science professor also over there, whose father was interned, grandparents, parents, so went through all of that. I think the important aspect is to recognize that you have to do something. Because what's going to happen is it's not most of the people that agree with it. It's actually this very significant minority, and then everybody else just kind of let it happen. And I think that's exactly what happened with the Japanese Americans. It didn't even get into the comments about if it was to protect the Japanese. The problem with that theory is the restriction zone was only the West Coast. There was Japanese Americans living all over the US who were not interned, they were just on the West Coast. So it's not even an efficient system, because there were still Japanese and very dangerous Japanese Americans in more dangerous areas that were running around. So that's the other, and I think the same thing with the countries that they're talking about with the Muslim ban that have never been linked to terrorism. But I think what happened is these really weren't, and why it's much more dangerous in this respect is these were not like these foreign people that were not integrated into society. These were Japanese Americans that just thought they were like everybody else. My aunt was like the vice president of her student body. They were playing on the football team. They only spoke English. So it's very much, if you ever want to kind of ask yourself, what would it be like if this happened? Just what it would be like is if anybody of any ethnicity living in the United States, somebody bangs on their door and tells you have to pack up and leave. Because that's what it was. They didn't know this could happen. And I think that's the same thing. It's this, yeah, never again. I love it so much, but it's BS. Because it just will happen again if you let it happen again. Because it's the same thing as, we'll do this, and you hear ethnic studies classes where they say, yeah, I never thought it could happen to me until it did. Because it will if you let it. And I think that's, and again, just kind of ignoring, I mean, there's Earl Warren right up there, and he was the Attorney General, did enforce the internment, right? And so we got a college named after. because he did great things after. I mean, I get the Brown versus Board of Education. I personally think some of that was inspired because he was the Attorney General in California who had to enforce the internment of Japanese Americans. So I think in response, I think it's you have to just speak up against it, even though you don't want it to, because if you don't, those ones that can will, and they have guns. And I think that there's all these stories of Alan Simpson, who was the senator of Wyoming, meeting Norman Etta when he was locked up, and they talked to each other when he was in the camp. These two guys that later landed serving in Congress together. These were not these foreign people that you really didn't understand. I mean, if it could happen to them, it could happen to anybody. And so I think that's really how you have to think about this. It's honestly not enough that we just have us here. You have to go face those people that aren't here. Because we all get it for the most part. It's the ones that don't. And I don't know if you're gonna help them get it, but what you have to do is you have to resist their agenda. So.
Well, nicely put. Thank you for that.
I have a question that's not going to be related to what mostly talked about. My experience is, when I'm looking with the crowd, I'm looking for gray-haired people from San Diego. Because I think, not documented, but I believe I was the first Japanese American back in San Diego County. I'm from the little town of Encinitas, 25 miles from here. And I had an experience downtown, so I would like to see hands of anyone who was here before February of 1945. That's when I came into San Diego. I was kind of a special case. The community of Encinitas accepted me back and welcomed me back as a person, which is very gratifying. My question being, I had a very bad experience in February of '45. I got up in the parking lot on Broadway, where the Marston's department store was, and it was a very frightening thing to see all these windows plastered with derogatory remarks and threatening remarks, as a lot of you are talking about. You know, it is what the people say and do that really prevails and makes you, it's fear, it's a fear factor, really, right? Anyway, so if there's anyone here that was here before February 45, I would like to see hands. I guess I was the first one back. So I can compare my experience with the little town, as you just said, my companion, president of the Historical Society. That town is totally different than what I experienced here in the city of San Diego. Our little town of Encinitas welcomed me back with open arms, well, naturally, of course, because my dad was a fisherman here in San Diego first, and then he was the first Japanese family farm in North County in Encinitas. So I naturally went through kindergarten through the time we was evacuated in March of '42. Now, I was a member of the largest camp in the United States, Poston, Arizona. Camp 3 was all San Diego. The Camp 2 was most of Middle California. So it was a real experience that I really enjoyed, really. People might complain about enjoying the camp life, but as it was stated, and a lot of you had noted, that we were called a relocation center, internment camp. Never were we referred to as a concentration camp. Basically, that's what we were in, a concentration camp. Anytime you're surrounded with barbed wire and sentries with machine guns on the towers looking over you, to me, that's a definition of a concentration camp. But in spite of that, we all persevered and we came out. Well, myself personally, I came out a better person, I think. So, if there's anybody here that has family, or well, I know a lot of San Diego people actually. My dad was fisherman here first, and then a farmer, and Camp 3 being all basically San Diego. So, you know, I have a lot of acquaintances. But I'm curious because what was the attitude after my initial shock of February '45? Did the city or the public change themselves and their attitude? That's what I'm curious about. Because I left the area for quite a while before I came back. So if anyone can answer that question for me, I'd be appreciated.
So my name is Jim Glenn. I'm a retired math professor here at UCSD. I served here for 40 years. I actually taught the first Asian American Studies course back in 1986. And we did discuss the internment, and we spent a lot of time on the internment. We thought of all the costs to Japanese Americans. And then afterwards, I should say that there was a huge community of students and faculty. There may be 50 faculty who signed a petition that we should have some Asian American Studies professors on campus. So the fact that Dr. Mann is here is, you know, now that I'm retired, I fought so hard for it, but now we have Dr. Mann, I'm thrilled. But also, he has a special responsibility, I feel, and that's to disseminate this information. Because, you know, back in 1986 when I taught it, there was only a few more years when the lessons in the internment were actually taught. And I think this is a big factor. You know, what can we do? Well, right now I help start a cross-cultural center as well, and there's a proposal for an Asian Pacific Islander Middle Eastern Center. And when we look, we have about 40% Asians and Middle Easterns on campus, and yet we have no representative. You know, we have a Raza Center, we have a Black Resource Center, but these issues, so many administrators told me that there's no racism against Asians. And here's, I mean, when you have 120,000 people lose their homes, lose their livelihoods, have all this stolen from them, and they end up in camps for 3 years, and then a missing fact that's not mentioned, actually in San Diego County, that I see a few people whose parents fought in the 442nd, I don't know if you've heard of this battalion. These were people in the camps, their sons and daughters signed on to fight in the war, in World War II, and, you know, to prove their loyalty to the U.S. So even though they were imprisoned in these incarceration camps, they decided they had to prove their loyalty. They're already American citizens. Well, that might be the end of the story, but my church has a lot of these people who were interned, and so I asked one of them, and they don't want to reveal this. They're such honest people, but I asked, you know, of the 258 people from San Diego County who fought in the 442nd, how many people survived? How many people returned back to this country alive? Take a guess. I'm a math professor, so I'd like to have those guesses. Do you have any idea? 50. 30% is actually 8. 8 people out of those 258 returned back alive. And this is a hidden story. People don't think about that. They don't think, okay, clearly there was racism by putting people in the camps, but on top of that, think of the price you pay when your father doesn't return. Okay, so I need you people to publicize, to give out that information, because we're at a university, in high school and middle school, they don't even teach any of this. So no wonder, you know, our country has these kinds of opinions that we have to, you know, put people in camps and so forth. And the other thing that Dr. Provence mentioned, that, you know, that student asked, what can we do? Well, we live in isolation. You know, I don't know about in San Diego, many of us, we drive out to work, we push our garage door opener, we get back in the garage, we don't talk to our neighbors. How many of you have a personal relationship with Muslims? You guys are off the charts. Okay, I'm telling you that, you know, the only way that, you know, and he mentioned, well, we should be related. We're not. You know, as a country, we're not related. We've got, you know, a democracy only works if you're related to the people around you. And many of us Asians are walking around not talking to Muslims. And so we buy into this idea that, yes, Muslims might be terrorists. And that's a huge factor in, so two things. One is the education, you know, that it would be great if a place like UCSD thought about systematically educating people about the internment. And then secondly, that we would become related. We would, you know, maybe do service projects, things like that together and find out. You know, I'm thrilled to meet Dr. al-Delaimy here. I mean, this is something that I came here to do. So. Good.
I want to apologize to all the hands that I'm seeing. I'm really sorry. But thank you. This is great that you all came out, that we don't have the room anymore. So Professor Provence wants to say any last words.
Thank you all for coming. Sorry, that's a little bit too loud. Thank you all for coming, and let's get to know our neighbors, shall we?